What's going on with emotional intelligence in the world? I think a lot of us have asked that question over the last couple of years and seen some interesting challenges. Now we have new data that's going to help us understand the state of the world's emotional intelligence. This is the world's largest study on EQ, or emotional quotient, and it's been going on since 2011. And today we have one of our co-authors in the study, Tom Mazzo, who's here to help us explore some of this data. And Tom, why don't you come in and just tell us, before we bring in the panelists, why do we do this?
Well, thank you, Josh, for the introduction. Well, why do we do this? I think originally we were discussing with the team on, what new project we should do. And so one of us said, we are one of the organizations that's testing widely in many languages all across the globe. So if we don't do it, who should do this? So we basically felt the responsibility of looking into emotional intelligence globally and kind of seeing what the trends are and what are some useful insight we can get from the data that we can share with the world. And so that's kind of how this came about.
So I'd like to just share a little bit of the report with you all, and then we'll introduce our panelists. First of all, this is a sample from over 129 countries, and it's a random sampling methodology, which means it's not necessarily the truth, but it's a very robust study. And one of the initial findings that I want to point out is this cloud. This is everybody in the data, in the sample, that shows their emotional intelligence score on the horizontal axis and their combined success score. And for us, success is made up of these four things. Effectiveness is about getting the things done that you need to get done, building professional and personal relationships, having mental and physical health, and creating a life that you feel good about. So, Tom, what does this graph mean?
Well, this is showing a trend, right? To simplify, it's showing the distribution of scores is not random. It follows a really clear impact line, which we, as you've shown underneath the graph, is like 53%, I believe. So what that means is just a little movement on the horizontal axis, on the EQ axis, from, let's say, 80 to 81, it's likely to be responsible for a little bit of a movement vertically. And that's more and more true, the more you're in the middle of this graph, I would say.
Great. All right. So in simple terms, if you want more of those outcomes, emotional intelligence is a very likely way for you to get there. And so I'd like to take a moment and ask each of our panelists to share with us, maybe May, we could start with you. What's one reason that you're interested in this data? And so introduce yourself, tell us something about your interest in this, and we'll go down the line here, and then we'll jump into some more of the data.
Yeah.
And the old unmute problem. It's still pandemic time.
You'd think I learned this after a year of doing Zoom. So, hi everyone. My name is May Duong, and I direct our social emotional learning program at Synapse School, which is a K-8 independent school in Menlo Park. And so for me, this report is super interesting as it has many ways of looking at social emotional learning across the globe. And I'm particularly interested in the impact that the pandemic has had on our students and our teachers and our parents, mental well-being, sense of resilience, sense of optimism. And so it's just so rich. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion today to dive deeper into some of these areas.
Thanks, May. How about you, David?
I'm David Bransten in San Francisco. I'm the manager of a workforce development program at St. Anthony's. which is a social services agency that provides support to vulnerable populations and communities. And as the workforce development manager, what is particularly interesting is working with folks who are looking to re-enter the workplace and what that landscape looks like, especially those that are in a very transitional place in their lives themselves, and what the threats are, and what the opportunities are.
Thanks, David. Solange.
Hello, everyone. My name is Solange Waileman. I am the co-founder of Sanap Emotional Intelligence, the preferred partner of 6 Seconds in Brazil. I'm based in São Paulo, Brazil. And I believe this study is fantastic. I loved that because I can share in a visual and clear way with my clients how emotional intelligence is impacting all the people around the globe. And this study reflects especially the impact in the senior management. And we are especially interested in how women is impacted by that, related to their results. And especially the human in the pandemic, they are really overwhelmed with everything, working from home and taking care of children and everything. And development EQ skills is helping a lot. And this data is fantastic for us to share with our clients.
Thanks. And Michael.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Eatman. I'm the founder of Culture 7 Coaching, and I'm really, and also a preferred partner at 6 Seconds. And I'm very excited about the data because I do culture work. And when we think about diversity, some people keep it as one thing. But when we look at leadership, I think about diversity as leadership. And so as we see the EQ in the overall sectors in a global fashion, what it does for all of us as cultural leaders is it gives us a sense of where people are. And when I think about my feelings, it's exciting because my work is about building leadership capacity. So a lot of what the data shows, and I won't give you too much because we're going to hear it in a minute, it validates what many of us have been saying. And it gives us hundreds of thousands of examples where people have said this. And so when we go into organizations, it really helps to offer greater data, but also validation for what we've been feeling, the pressure, the downness, and feeling the generational swings. So it's very exciting because in education, healthcare, government, and entertainment, which I'm focusing most on right now, it really gives me something to chew on with my clients.
Thank you. Well, I want to dig into one of the graphs. And before I show you the graph, I think it's important to say that the way we measure emotional intelligence, we have competencies of emotional intelligence, and then we also have what we call brain talents, which are essentially practical tools that people can use to put their emotional intelligence into action. And most of this report focuses on the competencies of emotional intelligence, but there are a couple of brain talents that come in here. And one of the findings is looking at the 3 brain talents with the lowest scores in 2020. And before we talk about what this means or the implications of this, Tom, could you just explain what is this graph showing?
Well, we've been talking about the study has been going on since 2011. And on this graph, we're focusing on 2014 because it's the year where, I guess we could look at the first slide too later, but it's the year where our current EQ level is matched compared to the past. And you can see the emotional intelligence line is the first one at the top, and you can see it on this slide as well. So you can see there is a faint line that goes back as horizontally, and the level that we're today basically almost matches the level of 2014 after an increase over the last few years, which this is a huge finding, I would say. But yeah, going back on this graph, what we're looking at is there are three talents in this case, as Josh described them, that are not following that trend. In other words, they didn't increase as much in 2018 and 2019. In fact, they stayed pretty constant, and then they're now finding themselves dropping even more. And so they're, instead of being at 2014 level like total EQ is now, they're at a much lower point than they were in 2014. So it's a downward trend that keeps on going down.
So panelists, as you think about a world, and this, this is a sample, again, that's from 129 countries, a randomized sample. So we're talking about a picture of people all over the world. And this sample is balanced by geographic region, by gender, by age. Across all of these places, we're seeing a significant drop in imagination, risk tolerance, and collaboration. So I'm going to stop sharing that for a minute so we can see you. What does that tell you? David, let's go to you first.
I think it's, especially following the pandemic, it's very indicative of the fact that we have a lot of threat, not just the threat to those specific competencies, but threat in general, where we sort of see through that lens. It gives us less options, so we're less imaginative. And frankly, we know that, just from on the hormone level, cortisol can be counteracted by oxytocin, so the coming together of people. And so I think that's what you're seeing. When we talk literally about the resource of air, everyone's frightened, wearing masks, and so we start to think, well, this is my air, that's your air. So we become less collaborative. We become more, frankly, through isolation, less willing to engage, and that's what I've seen. In even our first responders and our essential worker teams that work in the social services.
Thanks, David. It's quite a metaphor to think about, like literally this barrier that we have in terms of when it comes to collaboration, that sense of distance. Who else has a thought they'd like to share about these three emerging threats?
I mean, I can say something real quick, and then I'll give the word to Michael. I think for me, collaboration especially is a trend that it's kind of connected to the other talent of connection as well, but it's this idea of like, that I think it's not a new thing. I mean, the collaboration dropping, it's not a 2020 alone finding. I think it's the thing that's not surprising to me, and it's also worrisome, is that it's been going on for a while, and I can feel it, that our society is going on to a more polarized kind of nature, and so collaboration decreasing makes sense, unfortunately.
Tom, you said it so well, and if you saw me, my head was like shaking, because collaboration is not a new. The challenge with collaboration is not new, and the fact that it's looks like it's getting worse. The triple threat of risk tolerance. As I work with senior leaders, they're doing all the work themselves. They're less willing to share it, and their imagination can't be as open because they're doing it all themselves. And so it's kind of this three-pronged cord that keeps tying them up. And I think what's powerful about the work that we do is that we can identify that, and then also talk about what capacity do we need to move through it.
May, could you talk a little bit about imagination? I know that's a big part of the work that you're doing at Synapse School is helping children kind of see beyond the limits that are in place. And what's your sense of the importance of imagination and the kind of pathway to change this trend?
Yeah. Well, I think imagination starts with children feeling safe in the environment that they're at, emotionally safe, physically safe, in order to be able to be expansive with their thoughts. And what we found in the past year and a half is that their world has shrank over time and has felt really uncertain, really unsafe, even scary at times. And so that has constricted their ability to play. I think physically also they've been constrained in terms of the space that they can take up and the activities that they can engage in. And so all these elements that are usually that feed imaginations have been taken away, and the social connection as well. When kids are able to connect with others, their peers or adults in their lives, they feel that sense of belonging and they feel that sense of safety that then can allow them to explore a lot more than they would if they were the way that they've been living in the last 18 months or so. So I think that it's not a surprise that those three things are all impacted. And I think that the way that education has been moving towards more achievement, just being very focused on achievement, has also impacted children's ability to play. Whenever there's budget cuts, is usually the playtime is PE, it's art, it's the classes where students are able to develop their imagination. So I think it's critically important for us to reverse that trend on imagination and collaboration and risk-taking.
Anyone else have a thought they want to share about this graph? I just point out, in what May just talked about, that there's an emotional theme here around risk and safety. And David mentioned that, Michael mentioned that imagination is something that's hard to do when we feel threatened. And so there's the common theme between these three things has to do with that sense of overwhelm, that sense that I have a place at this table? Is my voice going to be heard? Am I going to be seen? Or am I going to get pushed down, pushed away, pushed out if I try to lift up my head and say, well, hey, what if? Okay. Well, we'll go on to another graph then. One more comment on this? All right. So in the analysis, Tom, would you just explain about the sectors, and I'll share the first the first graph from our sector analysis.
Yeah, basically in the assessment, this emotional intelligence assessment that 6 Seconds publishes, we ask a variety of questions. And I mean, this research study is the reason why we do that. We want to be able to do some really targeted analysis and really understand what's happening in different parts of the world for different people, and really targeted, at going at the problem. And so sector is one of them. And we really, when you do an analysis this big, you have to look. It's almost like you're an explorer, right? You have to find what's interesting. And I think our attention got really. We really got some interesting information here from the sectors, and so we decided to really do a spotlight here. This year is the first time that we have enough data, I think, to do such an extensive research on sectors. We were able to look at that before, but this year we had enough data to really make a solid comparison among sectors.
So we chose these 14 where we had, again, we're trying to have this representative data from the world. So having enough data to be able to look at 14 sectors in 129 countries, well, it's not quite true, in 7 geographic regions at least. It's challenging to have that much data. So we have this overall EQ score, but I think the maybe more interesting part for us to look at is we did some comparisons of different aspects of emotional intelligence. So it's just starting with this emotional orientation. On the left, enhance emotional literacy, which is about understanding your own feelings, naming feelings. On the right, increase empathy, which is about connecting your own feelings and others' feelings. So this is a little bit more internal on the left and more kind of connecting beyond yourself on the right. And panelists, what stands out for you in this graph?
I believe I can add something about telecom and IT. It's not a surprise to me because IT becomes the most important thing last year. And I believe the professionals had to be more connected with people to help them, because they cannot work alone by themselves. They need to provide service and support to everyone, because everyone depended on them. And maybe can explain the increase of the connection from the IT people.
Interesting. And thinking about sort of how each of these sectors does what they do, and to what extent is that kind of is emotional intelligence internally oriented versus self being part of a larger story. Other observations? Anyone want to talk about education?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. It's really interesting that it's a very highly self, and just thinking about the kind of the Achilles heels that we have of collaboration, imagination, and risk tolerance. What I'm seeing, at least in the senior leaders that I work with, they have to stay very focused because it's a heightened alarms all around, and so they can rely on their strength. But the challenge of that is that they're becoming overwhelmed, overworked, burnt out, yet they're getting things accomplished. So there's a heavy emphasis on what the one person can do, and I think while that might be temporarily okay, it doesn't help the long term.
Interesting. And we were talking the other day about hospitality and travel as a sector. It doesn't work by yourself. Of course, the same thing is true about education. And yet the level of stress and threat that education has been under in the last 2 years has been incredibly intense. I know a lot of educators are feeling that sense of carrying burdens that are just completely unreasonable. And so it makes sense that when, in this face of this kind of storm, you kind of put your hood down, put your hood on, and put your, mask up and just try to make it through. Anyone else on this graph?
I wonder if this is also true of education pre-pandemic, because I wonder if it's intrinsic to how education is done. And it is usually about the acquisition of knowledge for oneself, and it's about this intellectual pursuit, but it's very individualized. And what this graph says to me is there's huge opportunities for education to be more social, to be more about the community, to really teaching our kids to be change makers, where they are collaborating with others to come up with creative solutions that cannot be thought of when one is by oneself, and that to understand the context of humanity and to really create solutions that has different lens contributing to it. So it just feels like there's big opportunity there.
Well, I mean, to your point, May, I think the data that's gone into the sector analysis 2018, 19, and 2020. So in a way, I mean, it could be a dramatic impact that 2020 had on the overall sectors, right? If there was something drastic happening, but it's also could potentially, probably more likely even, is that it's more of a typical kind of scenario. And the other one that was interesting to me is like the restaurants and food service being completely on the self as well, like education. And also, that one also had a huge impact on 2020 as far as uncertainty and definitely like, revolutionized the sector.
So this graph has to do with the way people evaluate risk. On the left is a competency that we call applied consequential thinking, which is really pausing to assess the risks and opportunities before you take action. It's kind of connected to caution. And on the right is exercising optimism, which is about creating new possibilities. It's about seeing and saying, I don't know how to get there, but we will get there. And so, in a way, we could summarize those with caution on the left and daring on the right. It's a simplification, but any observations, panelists, that you want to share here about this graph?
Well, the one going back to the previous and this one, I mean, the closest I can come to social services is healthcare, and I would say that just to show up in these last 2 years, especially this last year alone, required such self-care to be present and to be available. And then, I think you want to, in some ways, you hope against hope. I mean, looking at all the hospitals and all the impact, and then looking at agencies in my communities, it's sort of the fuel that keeps you going. So while it's low, on the healthcare front, it's necessary. That's the necessary fuel to keep showing up, but kind of checking in and being available and providing that self-care to be available.
And that balance, I mean, it's actually surprising to me that there's as much optimism as there is, again, given the onslaught. And I think that's good news. Look, that there are a large number of people in that sector who are saying we can find new solutions. We can find possibilities beyond what exists right now. Any other sectors you want to call out on this one?
Josh, just a quick thought. As we're thinking about healthcare this year, I've had a chance to do some work with schools of nursing, and just the idea of kind of moving towards daring, and then also looking at the sense of connection. There's an opportunity, right? So if there's this moving towards that, leaning on having to have innovative thinking, and at the same time with leaders, how do we make sure that they're connecting with others so they're not going it alone? So I think it's really an interesting, what I've seen is people do it themselves, and because of the pandemic and other issues, they've had to push forth. And I think about this slide that was previous one to that about connection is shorter. So the goal again is how do we leverage that opportunity? And I think it's a powerful way to do so. Just something I saw that came up.
Well, and just sticking with healthcare for a second, we can look at one sector across all of these. So healthcare is slightly more on the long term, but pretty balanced in that one. And then the last one is about results. And are the results something you achieve, or on the left, or that you achieve through influence on the right? And interesting to me that I would think, like so many sectors, I would think in healthcare, you don't get the results without engaging and influencing others. And yet the orientation right now is towards, okay, I have to get this done, which may kind of reveal a more task-oriented approach, or a more kind of, I don't know, pragmatism, like, okay, we just have to get these things done.
Josh, I find also the entertainment being so high on influence so interesting, because this year was a year of a lot of racial tension, and there's been a lot of influence I feel the film industry has had on that, on those issues. And so I wonder if that is being reflected here in terms of documentaries and just films on Black Lives Matters, all sorts of issues that are being explored. There is like documentary on the Asian American experience. There's so much that's come out this past year that I wonder if that's something that's reflected here.
That's intriguing. And I think, again, a great point where this is a sector where like you can make a film, but if you don't engage people to watch it, kind of so what? That the way you get results is indirect. I was just looking at that sector again here on motivation orientation. Interestingly, more in the immediate, like, okay, task focused as opposed to vision focused. And then that sector here, I think this is a little surprising, particularly given what you just said, May.
That is interesting.
Any other sector somebody wants to explore? We can have lots of fun with this.
I gotta point out the education one, the more on the cautious side of things. And I think that there's the fact that in most sectors, the vaccines could have had an impact, a positive impact. With education, most of the kids have not been able to receive vaccines. And so it continues to be a very risky line of work for teachers and for parents and families being concerned about that. So I wonder if now that vaccines are going to be more available for 12 and under, how that would look with the cautious dimension.
Yeah, and I think it probably feels vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that may be a piece of this risk orientation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I also, on that graph, sorry, Josh, for interrupting, but this is probably obvious to people watching at this point, but those are basically looking at gaps between left and right? The bigger the bar is on the right, the more unbalanced that sector is on one end. And on 6 seconds, our methodology, we really focus and stress the importance of being balanced, because whenever there is a gap in between two of the skills, then there is a risk of potentially some traps, basically, that we could fall into as individuals. And I'm interested in the question is that statement true across the board, right? Or in some sector, in some situations, we might need to be unbalanced to do a good job.
Well, and I'm intrigued by this one, the education and the long-term orientation. It seems like it makes sense to me that what motivates people in education are the noble goals. And I think maybe that tells us something about part of why it's been so hard, is that when you can't actually when you don't feel like you are purpose, you're able to fill your purpose because you're far away from your kids.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that sense of that long-term purpose may get lost.
Yeah.
And I want to welcome Steve. Steve, thank you for joining us. And we, as you can see, are just exploring some of the different sectors. Is there anything else in this section that anyone wants to call out? I
think government being so not long-term is a little concerning. I mean, isn't that what government is supposed to do, is to look farther than the rest of us and plan for the future and be strategic? And it just feels really interesting.
You're going to get us in trouble here, May, but I think it's really interesting that if people in government are motivated by, okay, I'm going to do stuff today, and let's look at where is that sector on our other graphs. It's one we haven't kind of walked through yet. So let's just see. So we can see pretty far to the left on motivation orientation, but let's start at the top one with emotional orientation, government. More on the empathic side a little bit. And then...
That seems like good news.
Yeah. More on the evaluative, avoiding risk side, which I think a lot of us have seen, and maybe that's a problem again. Like, where is the innovation? Where is the opportunity for trying something new? And then motivation towards the short term, or practical is the positive, maybe more positive spin. And then in terms of how do you get results? Do you get results by doing it yourself or by engaging others? And a little bit on the engaging others. Interesting. All right. Well, folks who are watching, in case you didn't already notice this in the chat, you can get this report. It's available for free. The link is in the chat, and maybe somebody could put it in the chat again. Let's go on to our next section, which is about gender, and particularly about women in leadership is what we're going to focus on here. And just at a high level, what we can see in our first graph is that there is a correlation between overall emotional intelligence and career progression for women. And there's a pretty big, I mean, statistically, this is quite a big gap. When you're dealing with large samples in a normed assessment, the assessment is normed for everybody to be right near 100. So when you see this kind of gap, it's like, whoa, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of emotional intelligence change. And we don't know if it's, which causes which, but there's a correlation between a 6% increase in emotional intelligence between being an employee and being a manager, and then an additional 2.6% as women move into an executive role. There is one of the emotional intelligence competencies that we were very surprised to see actually declining rather than increasing. And Solange, what do you make of this graph?
First, Josh, I believe the first graph is a great news for us because it seems that only women with strong EQ will survive, and they will become executive leaders, and they will need to have a strong EQ to have good results on that. On the other side, on the other graph, it's surprising me a little bit because we can see that when they become leaders and senior leaders, women decrease empathy, and it's not good. No, it seems that probably is culture. Then women start navigate more emotions in senior executive positions and decrease empathy. But it's really not good because we know that to motivate people to being strong and effective leaders, you need to be connected with the emotions of your teams. And this result is not surprising because women then tends to be more connecting with men and trying to acting as a man, but it's not good at all for the results. And when we link it with the study that we did here in Brazil, we see that after development EQ, especially self-empathy, and connecting long-term goals to the daily activities, the perception of effectiveness were much more higher than before. And there are some competencies that women need to develop more: empathy, self-empathy, and pursue noble goals.
Thanks, Solange. Anybody else have a comment on this? What do you think is going on for women? May?
I do. Actually, I'm not too surprised by the results here. But where my mind goes is I wonder if it's an issue of role modeling. Like there's not enough women role models for women leaders to come into a role and see how you become an executive at an organization in a woman way. As because there's a lot of examples of how to be a male leader, not as many women leaders. And I wonder if there's also some stereotype threats here as well, too. Because if women show too much empathy, if there's too much feelings, then you are perceived as being too soft, or you're being too female. You're not going to be effective. And so there's a threat to counteract that stereotype of a female leader. And to be more like what society perceives to be an effective leader, and that's a male construct. So those are two things that come up for me.
And in unfortunately, it seems in every country, almost every country in the world, there's a strong preponderance of people in senior executive roles and senior government roles who are identify as male, and dramatically, in some countries, very dramatically smaller number of people who identify as female. And so I think that that's important for us to consider. This data is telling us something about maybe how women are adapting to environments as opposed to perhaps shaping the environments. I'd be really curious to see what would be the difference in, for example, a company that has a lot of senior leader women in it, whether it would be different. Other thoughts?
Yeah,
on
and I
this?
feel like part of it, we see in male senior executive, we see a similar thing, but now with empathy declining. And so what part of the story that to me comes out is that there is a stereotype that, we're kind of, it's the direction that we almost think we should be as when we are becoming a senior leader. We shouldn't be listening to people as much, maybe, and maybe be able to be cold-blooded in situations where you require to make some hard decisions, right? And that's what we see with Navigate Emotion going up. But empathy declining for the women study. It's interesting because it's almost an overreaction to the way men are, like trying to be even more like men, and kind of potentially swing into the other end of the spectrum even. And
more like the stereotype.
yeah, it's almost like we've been told that this is what gets rewarded, right? And then we're doing it as much as we can, because
Michael?
Yeah. Well, it's really fascinating. Before we got on the call this evening, I shared with one of the panelists that the market that I've been working with most recently are female leaders, and something that has been heartbreaking to hear tremendous leaders who are females talk about how they cannot be fully themselves. I mean, not just young leaders, but seasoned top level executives. And one of the things that we talk about with emotional intelligence is that feelings are data. So how do we begin to impact the culture of an organization to say what should the organization look like? What should it feel like? And then as we begin to explore the fact that feelings are data, I say, well, when you can't be your full self, what does the organization lose? And as a senior female leader, what does the organization lose? And after we talk about that, we say, well, what do you lose when you can't be your full selves? And as the person who's able to navigate emotions, how do we use this idea of increasing empathy to make the whole organization stronger? And that's why I think the emotional intelligence framework is so powerful to help to create transformative thinking.
So I want to go to another graph in a second here. But I would also just like to add the context of, given the emerging threats that we talked about before, right? And in a space where people are disconnected and we're saying we need to work together, but somehow there's not a context for that. And by the way, people are traumatized. The stress levels are phenomenally high. Mental illness burdens are increasing all over the world. People are in deep struggle. And it seems like a time where empathy could be really important. Solange, let's go back to you as an expert on this topic. Whoops, that was the wrong button. Sorry, there we go. Solange, let's go back to you. And what do you notice in these graphs? And this is all four of those left-right graphs in one screen.
Mm-hmm. This is a very interesting result, Josh, because you can see that in results orientation here, senior executive are getting more, are getting results through influencing people using the empathy. And if I'm not wrong, this graph are considering all the population or are related all only to human. Here is everybody together, no?
This is just women all
Just
over the
women?
world, all sectors. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. This is interesting. No, people are more casual, and you can see that when you are a normal employee, you take into consideration much more the risks and benefits before taking any decision here. And as you progress in your career, you can be more optimistic on that. I think you don't measure so many the risks, and for me makes sense. And the above one, the connection with the emotions, and all the human are much more connected with their own emotions, with their feelings, and it's something that I also noted here in Brazil. The human are trying to understand first their own feelings before being more connected with the others. And I loved with Michael and Tom told that we don't have many examples to follow. And if we had more examples of women in executive positions to follow, maybe this result would be different. I hope we can change this scenario in the future.
Well, there's a lot more to explore in this section. We also have a graph by regions, which maybe not surprising, but is striking. But I just know that we're going to run out of time here, and I want to make sure we get to this other topic of generational differences. And so, whoops, I did it again. I meant to press this button, generation trends. What you can see here is this collaboration data we looked at earlier by generation. And you'll notice collaboration went down in between 19 and 20 for all the generations, but a very large amount for Gen Z. And one of the things that we measure is sense of community. And look at this. Anyone have thoughts about those two pieces of data?
I wonder if there's the technology piece that plays into this. A lot of our, with the increase in technology, certainly over the last 2 years, because we're all isolated and students were on Zoom and they socialize through video games, through social media. And while that's supposed to be connecting, teens have a report that they are actually very isolated and very lonely from using too much social media. And so I wonder if the technology, the digital world has made them feel a bit less connected and less of a sense of community. There is online community, but it's quite different.
There's other research that correlates more technology use in young people with increased feeling of isolation.
Mhm.
And so that makes a lot of sense to me.
Mhm.
Other thoughts about this generation, Steve?
Yeah, I did a vital signs study with a large organization, and we saw the same things. This was last year. We did this, saw the same things, this disconnect with the younger generation. And I think it goes back to I think there's some underlying things going on here. The speed of business has only increased. So that is impacting women leaders. It's impacting younger generations. It's impacting everybody. And leadership is trying to apply old models to a new reality. I'm not sure we know what the new reality is yet, but there is a new reality, and those old models do not work. And I think that's where you're starting to see the gap in the generations. Others that have more maturity have seen things work in the past. They may be willing to stick it out longer, have more patience, but you're still seeing a decline across the board. So I think somebody used the term transformational. Maybe it was Michael. I think we have to start talking transformational here because the old models don't work.
We have our same scales across these 4 generations. And David, let's just go to you for a moment. Anything jumping out for you as you're looking at this?
Well, to go back to both Michael's and Steve's point, I think they haven't witnessed. They have a small sample size, so they haven't witnessed collaboration really working. And with the tone of discourse so shrill recently, there's no evidence to the contrary. And so, where does collaboration work? And when you are isolated, you tend to think your story is more fully written. So they're at home, they're been isolated, they think their story, and it's really when we kind of see ourselves as a work in progress, which is only in kind of a relational context. Otherwise, we're sort of complete. We sit at home, we look at the computer, I am who I am. And we start to kind of bear witness to ourselves as being transformed daily through interaction, through more. And it's not to say that these platforms aren't providing that, but not in the same way. And so on a bigger scale, solutions don't seem to be generated through collaborative effort.
Any other observation here anyone would like to share? I'm particularly struck by this risk orientation and Gen Z. That's not what I would have expected in the youngest generation. I think, historically, we don't know. We could go back and try to look at this data from 10 years ago, but I would think that we're biologically driven for younger generations to be more risk-oriented.
Yeah, Josh, just a thought as I talk with and think about family and friends and young people who are in Gen Z that I talk with. It's an interesting, I think it's something for us to look into. So this idea of, while there's a greater access to technology, as David said, there's maybe less experience. And so because of many folks who are in Gen Z have a different security, branching out may be a little bit more cautious. To buy a car, I have maybe the money, but I don't really know the nuance. And so I think that idea of let me just go slower, I've seen that at some level, and I think it's really important for us to explore. Something that gets me goosed up is to think about what's happening with boomers, right? Because on one hand, they are still relevant, and how do we support them? There's a sense of knowing self, right? What does that mean? We've been in a pandemic, and boomers are growing in some areas, and also thinking about the long term. So how do we leverage what's happening to Gen Z and the boomers? Seems like a rich and fertile space to explore.
To me, also, when I just had, sorry. I was just gonna say for Gen Z and cautiousness, there is another side of the medal, I think, there with cautiousness, which is we need to look at the impacts of our decisions. Like, the applied consequential thinking is that competency that helps us evaluate, what happens if I do this, what happens if I do that. And I think I can see this as being a huge thing for the new generation.
Well,
and thankfully so.
One of our colleagues has a newsletter she calls Generation Dread, right? And this is a generation that is confronting the existential threat of the choices of previous generations and saying, why aren't the rest of us seeing the threats enough? And maybe that's pushing them to focus on those threats even more. Well, we are out of time. Any final thought anyone wants to share? Something you want to go dig back into the report and read more about now?
Definitely the Gen Z piece. Definitely more exploration in that area. I think it's also, I think a lot about the way we parent and how kids cannot run down the street and go to a friend's house and start playing. And it's every day, everything is planned. There's a planned play date. There's a planned outing of any sort. And so the way that we're raising our kids is that we implicitly teaching them to be cautious. So I think that there's some exploration to be done there.
I wanted to thank all the panelists, but I wanted to pick up on something Michael had said, which is like the exciting opportunity. Yes, we can look at this through through terribly smoky, unhappy glasses. But on the other hand, the opportunity to explore these things and to have models like KCG and to have the models of 6 seconds and emotional intelligence and to understand that it's a practice, it's not a process, and that it's going back and exploring these things and pulling these threads apart is really an exciting opportunity to look at solution.
Yeah, I'd like to jump on something Josh said a while ago and everybody has touched on. With the current level of stress out there right now, we have the methodology, we have the answers, we have the tools to bring to people to help them find their best path forward. And I just have this real sense of urgency to do that because I see in business owners, business leaders, other people, friends, family, I see this uncertainty and stress levels rising, and I see relationships breaking down, and I see this burden, this black cloud that people are carrying. And I think we can be a ray of sunshine in that.
Yeah, it's very easy to get caught up in that trend of distress. And
it makes me think also like when we are in calm waters, right? We explain sometimes what it means to be in the middle of the graph in the leadership report. We say when it's in calm waters, you might be dealing just fine. You might be just dealing with what's happening in here. You're just fine. But these are not calm waters.
I think that's a t-shirt right there, Tom.
That's right.
It is not a time of calm waters. Well, folks, I think we should end on that point. Thank you, panelists. Thank you for joining. Thanks everyone who's watching. And we will be doing this again, continue to dig into this data. And I encourage you to follow us on social media, subscribe to the channel, and continue to participate in this conversation. How do we increase emotional intelligence in the world? We know these skills are vital individually and collectively. It's time for us to grow emotional intelligence and get that trend going back up. Thank you, everyone.